Welcome to Boroughs Burbs with hosts John Engel and Roberto Cabrera. Over the next hour, you're going to learn some insider knowledge that will help you overcome and strategize in the cutthroat world of real estate. Now, here are your hosts, John and Roberto.
Welcome, everybody. Episode 100. This is a major milestone, and we have a major guest this week, Jonathan Miller from Miller Samuel. Every year, Jonathan has to evaluate about $5 billion worth of New York real estate and crank out market reports every month on each of, 50 markets across the country?
Yeah, it's about a little over 200 reports a year.
200 reports a year. Nobody knows the market better than Jonathan Miller. And I can't wait to get into the show. We're going to have a free form discussion where we pin you down with 100 questions in rapid fire format. But first, I have to thank my host, my sponsor, gracefarms.org. I want everybody to know three things about Grace Farms. They should come out to New Canaan. That means you, Jonathan Miller, because I know you're a suburbanite now. Come on out to New Canaan, visit the 80-acre campus, check out the river building. It's beautiful. Second thing you need to know is that they've got the Design for Freedom. They're trying to clean up the building materials industry. So find out what that means at designforfreedom.com. And number three, if you want to give a closing gift to all your clients, you can get their fabulous sips and drips, teas and coffees at gracefarmsfoods.org. And with that, let's start our show. Roberto, good to see you. You're looking mighty casual in August.
Just came out. I'm in Southampton now, so a little bit of a breather from the city.
This is as casual as I get, Roberto. I better adjust that.
Fair enough. Well, there you go.
All right. Where do we want to start? I think we're going to have to start with the outrageous headline pulled from your most recent housing notes. Jonathan Miller puts out housing notes every Friday where he finds the best of the internet and the best of the market reports out there. And you talked about spurious correlation, and you talked about causation, and you talked about how this had really resonated with your economics students at Columbia University. What does that mean, spurious correlation?
Well, it just means that you can literally compare anything against anything, and the line trends the same on the chart, but it doesn't mean they have anything to do with each other. And I just finished my class. I teach a summer semester of market analysis at Columbia, about 150 students, and it's really fun. And one of the things that I'm always amazed at is, and actually the students by the end of the class, I always tell them, and I got this from a professor at Yale, that any chart without a source on it is a lie. In other words, you don't know where it came from. Just because it looks nice doesn't mean anything. And then it kind of goes along with this idea that you can chart anything. I mean, literally, you can make numbers work. You can visually do anything you want, and it's ridiculous. So what I try to teach the students is to look at things with a very critical eye, and don't allow that into your brain if it's not compelling or convincing, and that begins with understanding where the data came from. So that's my and then I throw in a few dad jokes.
So I guess the reason that it resonated with me is because all of the realtors in this country and all the pundits on TV are wrestling with causation and versus correlation. And we want to understand what is causing prices to go up in some of our markets, but not consistently. We want to understand causation. And I think that we see, on the one hand, the Fed tightening and raising rates and trying to put downward pressure on the market. And they've been largely unsuccessful over the last couple of years. We're beginning, but tell me if I'm wrong, we're beginning to see a flattening, but not necessarily a decrease in most of these luxury markets. So
in terms of pricing, pricing,
pricing.
Right. So across almost all the housing markets that I cover, the trend is, or the pattern is almost the same. And the way to think of the pandemic era and later, as we move out of it, is the word distortion. That a lot of the rules of thumb that realtors grew up with throughout their career have been thrown out the window. And the first thing that sort of defies logic, and I remember seeing a lot of national economists at the beginning of the Fed rate hike series were saying, oh, we're going to see prices correct 20-30%. And I was like, no, the reason why they're saying that is because they don't see the most important data metric of the current situation is inventory. And so because mortgage rates were kept too low for too long, in my opinion, people are wedded to their rate, and they're kind of stuck. They don't, they have a 3% 30-year fixed, and they're not willing to go to a 7 unless there's a major change in life, that's in their face. And on top of that, today we're publishing Elements publishing our rental research. We're looking at the city rental situation, and all-time rental prices records reached. The fourth time in 5 months we've had a median record rent, $4,400 a month, and almost $6,000 for average rental per month. That's the highest we've tracked since 2008. And you're going, why is this just going up forever? Why is this happening? But then, and boy, I hope they cut rates soon, because that'll bring people back in the purchase market. But the reality right now is unemployment's at 3.5%. I mean, it is rock bottom low. We have a pretty strong economy, but housing has been disproportionately impacted by the rise in rates. Other sectors not so much. So we feel like, as a market, we're under siege, but relative to the rest of the economy, not so much.
So let me just, what I think I hear you saying is, it doesn't matter what the Fed does. It doesn't matter, because they can go from 7 to 8 to 12, or back to the misery index of a couple decades ago. It doesn't matter what the Fed does when you have too few houses, and you're only ever going to get a trickle of new inventory on the market for the next several years, as the gap between current mortgage that I could get and the current mortgage I'm paying is so great. You're saying it doesn't matter.
Well, right now, in this scenario, it doesn't seem to matter. Or it's not that it doesn't matter, it's that so normally what happens is in a downturn, and downturn defined as rates spiking significantly. And so the first thing that happens is transactions slow. And so inventory piles to the sky. But inventory didn't pile to the sky because the fact that mortgage rates were kept too low for too long, that by raising rates at the fastest clip in 40 years, people are wedded to a 3% or a 2.75% 30-year fixed, with the option of, hey, if I go out and buy, it's going to be 7%. So they're going to take much longer to make those decisions. It doesn't mean they won't. And actually, the one thing I think that's really important to understand is, in this market with realtors, it's easy for me to say, but patience is a virtue. That over time, people acclimate to what rates are. They're not like, hey, if they never go down to 3, they're always going to see rates as super high. But over time, they acclimate. And I think that's already happening a little bit. But again, we're still looking at, a long process to sort of change that thinking.
I'm finding that in the marketplace as well, especially with the new buyers who never saw 3%. They don't even know that exists. And this is just the landscape with which they have to deal with. And that's how they're pursuing along. And then all the other people, life happens. People get divorced. They have, kids leave the house. People have to downsize. Eventually, there's going to start to be cracks in that dam where people, like, life has to start churning and it has to keep going. And some of those rates aren't 30-year fixed. They're 5-year, 10-year arms. That's going to reset. And then
Roberto,
then it's going to start it too.
That is such a key point, because I just remember in past cycles, it was very common to get a 5-year one or a 10-1 or a 7-1. But with rates being so low during the pandemic, that you didn't need to do that. It was just, they were basically on the floor. And so just pick something that's conservative and you're sort of locked in. But that's been in many markets that I've been through in 38 years. That's been a big part of the world, is like alternative to the sort of plain vanilla. One thing, I was doing an interview a couple of weeks ago, and the comment was made, right now in Europe, we're seeing, especially in the UK, we're seeing housing prices really fall. And that's because everybody there variable rates are the norm. In this market, in the US market rather, it's all about fixed rates. And so people are kind of locked in. That's like, you're locked in for 30 years or you're locked in for 15 years. So, you don't care. And because there's such a difference between what you bought your house at and what the rates are now, you're kind of, you have like this built-in savings or something, however you want to phrase it. So it's it's a unique moment in financial history.
It's like having a rent stabilized apartment. You kind of get locked in. There's people who stay in a rent stabilized apartment for 30 years, but they never bought. So they built no equity, and they, so
right, exactly. Right.
So if we can all agree that rates are having less and less of an impact, the fact that we're getting used to 7% rates and people have to move, and so the causation of rates is not as great as it would be. Let's talk about some of the other things that might break us away from this cycle of rising housing prices. One thing is, I'm looking at Hobbs Inc. there. Builders might start building. Builders might start saying, we have too little inventory and we're going to build, and zoning boards across the country, such as in California, where they recently approved accessory dwelling units, as P&Z loosens up around the country and allows builders to build. What's it going to take to get builders to build? Right now, they're afraid of lumber prices and commodity prices and labor prices. What's it going to get? What's it going to take to get builders building again?
Well, so you can see right now nationwide, the larger builders are buying down rates, and it's been extremely successful. So a 7-year 30 fixed is now 5.2. For, like on a $400,000 or $500,000 house for $25,000, and they can do that at scale, and that's been incredibly effective. The other.
Wait, where is that happening? Wait, where? Not in New York City.
No. I'm saying nationwide, like in the Midwest, on the West Coast. I'm reading about it every day. And I've talked to a few builders. That's an option, but it tends to be skewed towards the larger builders. The other thing is that when you look at inventory in a market, historically, whether you're talking about New York or you're talking about national, new construction is around 10%, sometimes 15% of total inventory. In many markets now, it's 30 to 50%, because it's not that more homes have been built, it's just that there is so much less existing product that you have this sort of, an overshare of new construction, which is solving, part of the demand challenge, which, is just another distortion created by this pandemic era, with the the dramatic change in interest rates.
Are we still short 5 million homes? That's a number bandied about for the last few years, that over a 10-year period, we built 500,000 too few homes every year for 10 years. And it was a long time to get us into this trough, and it's going to take us 10 years to get out. Is that
Well, so yes, yes, that's true. But I think actually it's worse than that. And what I mean by that is when you think of land prices and construction costs, the development product nationally has skewed more luxury or more higher end as a whole. So if you're talking about like middle class or starter homes, that's a much tighter inventory problem related to new construction than anything else.
I would love to have Hobbs speak up now on exactly that paradigm, because Scott has been running the housing authority here in my hometown, and therefore he's been charged to make a few hundred affordable housing units. And he said, well, why don't you tell us, Scott, what's the economics of building affordable housing now, given that we need it and builders want to build it and towns want to have it? How's it going?
Well, I mean, you have a problem that first off, again, construction costs are elevated, borrowing costs are elevated. Creating affordable housing is more expensive than creating normal housing. There's a lot of regulatory hurdles. And then there's no magic bullet for how you work the economics of these things. So if it costs more to produce, and then you can't charge rents that actually pay for what you're producing, unless somebody gives, makes up that economic difference, you're not going to get it. I mean, it's just, you can't function. For our housing authority, we're able to issue bonds, but the bondholders actually want to get paid back. I mean, imagine that. And if your pro forma doesn't work, they're not going to actually loan you money. And that's the same for the banks.
So with rising rates,
housing,
with rising rates and bonds getting more expensive, meaning you have to give a larger money for the bond, you're looking at, let's get specific. I think you were talking about when you began your term, $400,000 per unit was the construction cost if the municipality gave you free land. But you can't build units for $400,000 each anymore in this area. What's it costing now?
We think we're well over 500. I mean, it hasn't been tested. Our data is now 2 years old. But as an example, we did a 2-phase project that one phase was done in 2021. And that went really kind of smooth as silk. And the second phase, the builder basically lost all of the profit from phase 1 and from phase 2. And then that's how disastrous it was. It was a total catastrophe in changing prices.
And that was
the 500,000 builds you what? The 500,000 builds you what? 2 bedrooms?
We'll say on average, a 2-bedroom apartment inside of an apartment building that has some amenities, but relatively basic amenities.
Okay.
All right, I didn't want to get too far down the affordable housing route, but it's got to affect how you're thinking about the market, Jonathan Miller. When you're putting out these market reports and you're talking about too little inventory, we're not just talking about the luxury market, we're talking about all markets.
Oh, all markets. It's allowed me to pull out my old chestnut word or terminology is inventory was obliterated during the pandemic. It didn't decline, it was wiped clean. And the price of land is very high in our region. I'm looking at myself, which is always fun.
That's you on CNBC, that's you on Bloomberg television saying the pandemic wiped out housing inventory, says Miller.
Exactly.
You heard it here first.
That's it.
How does that, Jonathan, how does that happen? Where were people living before? These homes got all taken up by their second homes?
No, so the way to think of it, I don't know if this answers your question, but the way I think of it is, I think of inventory as this sort of blob. It's just a moving object that grows very slowly over time, that's based on the life cycle of the occupants, empty nesters, move up, new relocation, whatever it is. And so when you take this massive tsunami of demand caused by, 2.75% 30-year fixed mortgage rates, combined with people sitting in their houses for 2 years dreaming of getting more space, it wipes inventory clean, and
I think a
inventory.
bigger factor was the fact that we have too many millennials on the planet. Much bigger,
Well,
much bigger factor than interest rates. Fed doesn't matter. We just all had too many kids at one point, and now they're all at the point
are
where
you
they
saying
want
I
a
shouldn't have?
house.
Are you saying I shouldn't have had 4 kids?
You should not have had 4
3 are
kids.
homeowners.
You brought this on us, Jonathan Miller.
I'm trying to feel bad, but I don't. But I do think that supply was no match for, I don't think people realize, outside of the brokerage community, how insane the frenzy was nationwide. And then all of a sudden, that gets turned off and people are sitting with very low rates and they're not going to move. And that's kind of where we're sort of stuck. So like the way to think of this, like, how do we get out of this is, I think we desperately need a recession or some kind of adverse economic condition to bring rates down a little bit. They're not going to be down where they were. In fact, to sort of simplify it, I know you're like, hey, we don't care about the Fed, but we can't do anything about it. They're going to do what they're going to do. But think about right now, they're talking about maybe one more 25 basis point, maybe 2. And then what happens? They sit still for a while. And what happens when they sit still for a while? Mortgage rates drift lower, not dramatically lower. Instead of being at 7, maybe they're at 6.25. But that's going to bring more people into the market. And when that brings more people into the market, you're bringing in more inventory. Really the only thing that's going to bring people into the market faster than what Roberto was talking about with, change in life plans, over time, is that when rates lower, like I think the long-term sort of level they're going to be at is in the mid to upper 5s. I think that's where they probably should be. I think we've overcorrected. But
and that'll be in 2025, right? Not
that's a couple of years from now. That's right, exactly. It's not now. That's why I say patience is a virtue, when we think about, how the ebb and flow of rates and demand and supply. But really, that's what's going to bring people in.
So
and it's
you're at the major question that everybody has. All of my buyers are sitting there saying, if rates are going down, and you know what they're going to do, they're going to go to, what'd you say, 5.5? They're going to settle in at 5.5.
Yeah, probably.
And it won't happen until 2025. So all the people on this show who are going to watch this on YouTube over the next couple months are going to lean in on what you're going to say next. Does it pay for me to wait for 5.5% rates in 2025? Or are housing prices going to continue to rise substantially because there's so many millennials and there's such a great labor market and so many other good reasons that prices are going to continue to rise, and I'm going to miss out if I wait for the rates?
Well, now you're asking me to think like a broker, right? In terms of how to sort of sell.
The room is full of brokers. We want
Yes,
you
exactly.
to do the hard work for
Well,
us.
listen, I was a real estate agent for 6 months in 1986 in Chicago. And so I have a deep, extensive knowledge of what it's like. The way I think of it is it's a longer term window. I'll give you an example. And this sort of speaks to the economy. I think I've told you before, like I moved to Ridgefield, Connecticut, from Darien. I'd lived in Darien for 32 years, loved it, became empty nesters. And 3 of my sons had houses, not necessarily in Ridgefield, but in the vicinity. So we were a little closer. We moved, it was great. And then 2 months later, 2 of them got big job offers in Florida and Boston, and they moved. And what they said to me was, yeah, we're going to buy where we go, but rates are going to drop in a couple of years and I'll refi then, right? And I'm thinking, wow, I don't know if I totally buy that, but I like the spirit.
But the thing that happens is if you wait, it's like that my head of my newsletter the last time, it was like, are you waiting to buy next year? So's everybody else. And that's what becomes difficult, is that you then throw yourself into a pool where you're elbowing around with everybody, and the prices just continue to gravitate, and your opportunity to get it is the probability of getting it just gets diminished.
Well, it's herd mentality, right? And one of my sons he's a police officer, but he's also for years was a volunteer fireman, and he used to say, they're the ones that run in when everybody's running out, and sort of a little contrarian thinking, which I get. I mean, I think I told you when I was on before that I don't know what this has to do with what we're talking about, but my wife and I overpaid. We'd be 30 people for a house, and I knew rates were going up. I only think we overpaid about 36% based on the list price, but I think we really only overpaid 15%. And we're going to be in the house for at least probably a decade. So who cares? Other people don't maybe have that luxury, but we got the house we really wanted. And so I think time has to pass for people to get comfortable with the higher rate environment. And
also there's a whole group out there that aren't going to move at all, because like me, my rate's 275. I'm not going anywhere.
Right. So you say that now, but say something major happens or whatever, and you want to move, and it's 5 years from now, chances are you're probably gonna move, like at some point. But
I'm gonna move to New Canaan so I can be with John and but I live in Rowayton, and whenever I sell, I'm gonna make a nice profit.
Yeah, of course. Right.
All right, John, curiously, on your house, if you were to have waited and bought that house today, where would you be in regards to what you paid?
It's actually more expensive, I think.
See,
it's a little.
It goes back to the point before. You wait, and then you would have not built the equity into it in the time period that has already passed. You would have just thrown that money away on rent or something else. And the other thing is that you can't not put value on is your enjoyment of that house.
Every day, my wife and I, when we come, pull up to the driveway to the house, or we're leaving the house, we both look at each other and say, boy, I love this house. Like it's the weirdest thing. No regrets whatsoever, no cognitive dissonance, nothing. But that's us. But I think, the people, like I'm sitting there and we just couldn't get our house we sold on the market fast enough because of supply chain, because we had to replace 7 glass, sliding doors and like half of them would be delivered after 2 months and 2 of them are broken. You have to reorder, it's just like forever. Part of our house where we gutted was like open to the elements. You can't show the house with like a blue tarp covering one of the walls, that kind of stuff. So you couldn't, but at the same time, we wanted to get to buy, so we did everything wrong. In that context of we acted after the rates began to rise. That's when we put our house on the market.
You're in Connecticut, I'm in Connecticut, but half of our market is sitting there in New York saying, wait a minute, is the rest of the market having a party and they didn't invite us? New York might be having record rental costs right now, but Roberto says that they don't have an inventory problem, right, Roberto? You don't have an inventory.
I think inventory is, I think it's fair, but and I've been thinking that it was more ample than it was. And I've really looked at it recently and studied it a bit more. And we are a little bit below the running average for probably the last 10 years. We're a little below that. So it is a little tight, the inventory, but also the inventory, it's the quality of the inventory. A lot of it's old product that needs a lot of work and things like that. It's the new stuff.
Actually,
could potentially go.
I think you are, actually, I don't think if you like, right? Because
I can tell you with inventory, there's a sort of a rich history of the Manhattan inventory relative to the rest of the country. It goes back to the pandemic, and Manhattan was late to the party. Suburbs, everything was flying off the shelves. The pandemic, we were the global hotspot, and until there was a vaccine and the mindset changed about the city, it reacted about 9 months later. So then when the Fed raised rates a little over a year ago, it interrupted the boom that would have taken place like the suburbs did. And so as a result, inventory was not wiped clean. It was reduced, but as Roberto, you were saying, the levels are not chronically low like we see in Westchester and Fairfield County and New Jersey and Long Island and virtually the entire US. In Florida, it's the same story. In California, it's the same story. Texas is the same story. Manhattan is probably one of the better places to be an agent to sell at the moment because there is more product. The problem is that a lot of the new product that has come on, I wish I could quantify this better. The sellers haven't capitulated to the new conditions. And so there's a lot of product that's not priced right, disproportionately more than we would typically expect.
Wait, prices are going to rise generally across the country, but you're saying in New York, it's overpriced?
No, I'm saying that inventory is elevated in comparison to most of the US. It's not high. It's sort of Goldilocks, right? Just right. But the rest of the country is insanely low. And when I say the rest of the country, obviously every single market, I'm sure there's markets where it's not as low, some are lower than others, but literally all the markets that we cover, it is, Westchester is like the third lowest inventory totals since the 1980s. Like it's just gone. It's just not there. And that's different in the city in New York, not Brooklyn or Queens, but in Manhattan. Inventory is not chronically low in the same way. It's sort of, just right.
So Roberto should be killing it. He's in a balanced market, right? There's no excuse.
It's not, I mean, I think it's a fair market. It's definitely a far better market for buyers now than I do anticipate it being in the spring, because in the spring, I think there's going to be more normalization of people being accustomed to the interest rates. I think there's going to be a lot of people that it's now just that time to jump in. It's that breaking point that people have been patient and their life just moves on and they have to start transacting. I have a guy, poor fella, he bought this apartment. He got a 7-year fixed mortgage where it was going to adjust. He was going to and he was going to own the apartment for approximately 7 years. He was going to sell at the very beginning of 2020. He was about to go to market in February of 2020, and then COVID hit, ruined it. So then he goes back and he looks to resell his apartment last year at about May. Interest rates spike, loses the marketplace again. And now his interest rate has adjusted from like 2.8, it's now 7 something, and he's dying. He's like, I got to get out of here. So he's just he's hit every bad pothole there is.
Well, I think, Roberto, like, it's not like the people in the Manhattan market are oblivious to, how much rates have gone up, and there's an uncertainty, despite having more supply than, say, the typical suburb surrounding New York does. There's still sort of the psychological impact of and higher rates itself. One of the things that has happened a couple months ago, we reported that I can't remember, it might have been May or June, that cash buyers in terms of market share in Manhattan were the highest in history by far. It was 2/3 were cash
Yeah, you
buyers.
posted like 59% of deals, something like that. You
Yeah,
posted.
yeah, it was a big number. And so there was like this, hey, everybody's just paying cash, right? And it's like, no, it's that there are fewer people getting mortgages, and that's making the cash share expand, right? Like, you can have fun with numbers, like we said at the top of the show. You can, that's a little bit of a misnomer.
So is deal volume, deal volume is below the average right now. Granted, it's distinctly different from 2021, but even from April, May of last year to now, it's below the average.
Yes. So just for general context, if you look at because most recently completed quarter, second quarter, deal volume over the last decade is averaged about 2,800 transactions, and we had just under 2,300. So it's a little bit less. It's not a record low, but it's less than normal. But then
as is inventory, a little bit less than normal, a little bit
Correct.
less than transactions.
But then if you look at, during the boom, let's call it 2021, sales activity was double, but it had surged way beyond norms. It was about 4,500 units, more than double. Normal is, just under 3,000. So that's the pullback, right? The spike in rates, uncertainty. And the interesting thing about this, and I think it's lost in translation, is, I've said before that, the Fed is basically just beating the economy with a baseball bat, like trying to cause higher unemployment, trying to create damage. And we saw some evidence of that with the SVB banking crisis, First Republic, Signature Bank, Credit Suisse. Like, we saw some damage, but it didn't expand. That was sort of isolated. So they're trying to create this damage because the economy is so vibrant, so strong. And what do you need to buy a place? Well, you need a job generally, and you need adequate wages. And what's really interesting to me, and maybe a little wonky, but for the last 30 years, employment or wages themselves have been a deflationary factor, meaning that now we have wages expanding, which I think is wonderful for the economy. But that also translates into home buying. It's just that you have this very sort of visual impact, economic impact in your face that, hey, mortgage rates are 7, they were 3, it's a lot more expensive. I'm going to wait, right? Even though I've got a job, I'm making more money than I was a few years ago. There's like a tipping point or something that needs to sort of create. And I think the tipping point is going to be when the Fed stops raising rates, not cutting, just stops raising. I think that's going to stabilize
That should be any
things.
minute now, right?
But can we talk about that?
One or two more times, probably.
Once they even stop, like, I think it's going to remain sustained for an extended period of time, because if the economy is running so hot, and they're really the emphasis is to slow it down, how can they lower them at all?
Yeah, unless you have unemployment rocket up to 8% or whatever, which seems ridiculous. So I agree with you. So I think the more important thing to think about is stability in rates, and that mortgage rates will, sort of naturally drift lower, and people will have acclimated to or are in the process of acclimating to this sort of new level, and not sort of hoping we go back to 2.75, as a rate. And I think we see activity pick up, because we'll also see inventory pick up a little bit too.
So the Fed holds. Okay, the Fed holds the rates. What causes rates to come down to 5.5 by 2025? Is the economy just going to be that strong? I mean, what is the impetus? What is the causation, or what is the causation for rates to come down?
So it was that we were going to have a recession in 6 months, but the economists are saying that for the last 2 years. Like every month, it was like, yeah, we're going to have a recession in the next 6 months. And then the next month will go by, yeah, we're going to have a recession in the next 6 months. And it's been 2 years, and no, we haven't, and in the last Fed meeting, Chairman Powell said, we don't see a recession in the near term. So it's not going to be like this massive event where we're going to have all these problems. I think, like everything, it's just gradual. I think the key word in economics right now is gradual or slow in terms of change, as opposed to this sort of knee jerk, hey, spike rates, so now we're going to cut rates. It's not going to.
What does a presidential election do to the housing market? Well,
in Manhattan, I did a study about 5 or 6 years ago, and it distorts quarterly trends, like during election year. I don't know if I haven't done this for Fairfield County or Westchester, but in Manhattan, it definitely, I'd looked at over the last 30 years, 25 years, and looked at the parties, and whoever is the winning party in Manhattan, because it's heavily Democrat, you have this sort of weird distortion where leading up to the election, the 3 or 4 months prior to election, there's an unusual slowdown in activity. And then in November, no matter who the party is, there's a massive release that goes all the way through into the next January or February. But it all comes out even in the wash. It's just sales activity gets distorted a little bit.
It becomes much ado about nothing. Everybody's like, oh my gosh, and then here come the ducks, and they all pass, and then everything just keeps going as normal.
That's correct. So what you normally expect on a federal election, and to a lesser extent on midterms, is a little bit of pullback after like 4th of July through early November, and then December there's a massive release. That doesn't happen in the other year, the odd year, the even year for the federal election, either midterms or the nationals.
100% agree.
That's what I've seen happen. So it doesn't change pricing. Ultimately, the year-end totals are probably unaffected. It's just this sort of slowdown and release that occurs.
Can we talk? I think the biggest story to me by far is just the fact that the interest rates have just absolutely obliterated everything, and certain things have broken. There was a couple banks that broke, and everything's kind of warped. The general rules of thumb, like we were talking about, that that we rely on.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems like what's breaking most is the housing market, because
it is disproportionately.
And let's just say interest rates went to 8.5. What's next to break, or what happens? What should we be looking at?
I mean, you're like on the edge of the abyss and you're going to die, like sort of like that. No, I don't. I really don't.
Like John mentioned, it doesn't matter. They go to 12%. It doesn't seem like it's going to matter. Is that true?
Well, I mean, to sound like an old person, when I first entered out of college, mortgage rates were like 18%, and when I became a real estate agent, they were at like 13, and I did a lot of business. So what's different here is that the rise in rates haven't had a dramatic impact on pricing. And so like it has in Europe, where they're relying on a variable rate. So I would think that inventory is not going to get fixed unless there's a big change in interest rates. Interest rates go down a lot, you're going to see a lot of inventory come into the market, and prices may even with a lower rate, could even soften prices a bit. The one thing I learned during this pandemic is that lower interest rates make housing less affordable because it removes inventory disproportionately, at least in this cycle. And people don't think that way. They think, hey, lower rates makes it more affordable, but the buyer and the seller are getting the same news. It's not like it's a secret that lower rates mean you can sell for higher. And then
I think lower rates means more competition.
Yeah,
prices
yeah,
up.
and you
Big
get
time.
rid of inventory because sales outpace the ability of inventory to sort of grow. Then you get disproportionate housing increases. For example, the last couple of months nationally, we've seen prices begin to rise. They slid single digit from peak, pandemic peak, before the Fed took action, and now prices are starting to trend up again. But you know what's trending up again? Bidding wars. The market share of bidding wars in Fairfield County is like 46% of the transactions that closed in the second quarter. I'm calling that from memory, but it's somewhere like that. And during peak, it was almost 60%, a year and a half ago.
Is that true everywhere? Is that true in Dallas? Is that true in Palm Beach? Are we seeing? I know that
sort of
Fairfield County.
So for example, in Southern California, like I cover LA County, Orange County, and San Diego County. And I can't remember if it was San Diego or Orange, but they were both about pretty similar. We were looking at like almost 70% bidding wars, market share of closings, a year ago. And in some submarkets, it was over 90%. In Florida, not so much. It's more in the 30-35 percentile, because they had more supply coming into the pandemic than the New York metro area did. So I would say, to sort of stereotype the whole country, during the peak, which is just before, call it the first quarter of 2022, that bidding wars across the US were probably the market share range from the lowest I recall seeing would be around 20%, and the highest was, for an entire region was like 65-70%, with submarkets going even higher than that. Now, all those markets have came way down as rates rose. So they were only 20, say a market that was 50% was 20%, which normal is like 5%. So 20 is still a big number. And that's because inventory never really, came out onto the market. So you still had bidding wars. And now we're seeing bidding wars really ramp up again to be more than in some. I'll bet you next quarter, the markets like, Fairfield, Westchester, that were like in the 40s could very easily be over 50 as a market share.
So let's recap. So what I'm hearing is interest rates will fall over the next 18 months. They'll go flat, and eventually they'll fall, but not fast enough and not enough to warrant waiting for the market to correct. So don't wait, because interest rates aren't going to be enough for us. The second thing is we're experiencing bidding wars, and in Fairfield County and a lot of desirable markets, submarkets across the country, we're starting to see 100%. People are paying 100% on average for the next decent listing. And I say that by decent, meaning it's modern, it's nice shape, it's highly desirable in a good neighborhood, it's not functionally obsolete. We're going to continue to see those bid right up to 100% of asking, maybe even a little bit more. So for the next 20 months, we should expect bidding wars. These millennials coming out into the market for the first time should expect bidding wars. They should steel themselves to it and say, I may have to bid more than once before I find a home. It's just part of the new reality, right? Right through
Correct.
2025.
That's an absolutely correct assessment in my
Don't get
view of what's happening.
discouraged. Set your expectation right now that you're going to lose 3 or 4 or 10 times before you get your house.
I agree.
Okay. I
Musical
have
chairs.
to ask you about greedflation because you said because you put it in your housing notes. Greedflation because you did just say our wages just went up, and that's part of the reason we're spending more on housing. But our
Right.
wages didn't go up that much. They
No.
didn't go up as much as housing did.
No.
So what's going to happen over the next 24 months? Are our wages going to continue to go up, and yet
No.
housing's going to
Well,
flatten?
I think wage growth is already easing or cooling, but not dropping like a stone or anything like that. I also, the part I found interesting about greedflation, that was a good friend of mine, Barry Ritholtz, who has a radio show, which I'm going to be on in a couple of weeks, called Masters in Business. And he has a blog that all of you should look at called The Big Picture. And it's basically macroeconomics. And he's one of the smartest people, aside from you guys, one of the smartest people I've ever known. He's a good friend. And the whole thing about greedflation, this idea that, people are just jamming prices higher. Yeah, that's it. Ritholtz.com. I think he still has that orange overcoat. So the whole point about greedflation, and there's a lot of talk about that during the pandemic, where people are jacking up prices, because people are desperate, supply chain issues and all that. But the thing about greedflation is that if you're willing to pay that, but just be irritated, you're part of the reason there's greedflation. It's like you're part of the problem because you're willing to pay that. If no one was willing to pay those prices, then you wouldn't see it.
Are we
I just thought that was
the end of greedflation, where people are not
Yes.
willing to pay up for new cars?
Yeah,
used
we're
cars?
already seeing that.
But they're
It's
still
not
going to pay
it's not
for housing.
gone. It's not gone, but it's still there. Yes.
It's like the
Well,
restaurant in the Hamptons.
Yeah.
You go back to Manhattan and you're like, wow, this isn't so bad.
Right.
I mean, it's
Right.
incredible.
I have a lot of relatives. My wife's from Michigan, and I go there, and we go visit family and my 93-year-old father-in-law, and you go out to a diner there for breakfast, and it's like free compared to here. It's like
It's cute. You want to leave them more money.
Yeah, it's like, a family of 4 can have a breakfast for $15. It's insane.
We only have 1 minute left, and I can't end the show in Michigan. Take me back to New York, the center of the new known universe. We have a balanced market, but in New York and San Francisco, you got too much commercial real estate and not enough residential. Are we going to start to see a shift?
Well, so I think what we're going to see in the commercial world, and this is what's confusing everybody, because we have record rents, high housing prices historically, and then we've got half empty office towers. So, if you rely on Castle data, right? Yeah, so you're looking at that and you're going, how does this make sense? And you're seeing, certain restaurants in Midtown packed and sidewalks, it's I wouldn't say it's back to norm, but tourism is almost back to normal levels. But you have empty office towers, and I won't bore you with just having gone through a new office space. I'm paying 45% less than I was before the pandemic.
Can we repurpose that space as housing?
On the fringe, there's actually a white paper that just came out that's pretty good about, I'll have it in my notes tomorrow, about what are you repurposing the space. And it's only about 5 to 10% of commercial office space is suitable to repurpose. And the big reasons are the cost to convert to residential is problematic. It's almost a non-starter right then. The other is changing zoning. And one of the bigger problems, especially with the bigger office towers, is the floor plates are too big. You know, unless you want to have apartments that are 20 by 400, you know, it just doesn't really work. You can see some of those layouts, like with the former Bank of New York building, One Wall Street, where you have on the lower floors, the floor plate's so big, they have these really long apartments that don't really work. So the challenge is you've got, you know, oversupply of office in theory, or underutilized, and then you've got an undersupply of housing, you know, affordable housing. So hey,
And it's not getting fixed.
Right. And so the way I think of it, and this is again a longer term, is that you're going to have, like when I was looking for space, you can't, most landlords can't drop to market rate, because then they can't pay their debt service. So what happens?
We have a
Eventually they go under it, you know, someone takes a financial hit, and then it gets transferred into stronger hands at a much lower rate. Then you have New York City seeing this massive inbound of people that are used to be priced out, that can, you know, that will take office space, maybe smaller, you know, amounts of it. But, you know, if you go to market, you're going to bring it in. And that's why I'm not worried about the future of New York. It just has to go through these machinations over the next 5 to 10 years.
We got to have you back. There's so much more to talk about.
Yeah, I think this is great. I think we've lost the folks at Voice America, but because it's already 4 o'clock. But
Gotcha.
we don't have to end this, because I'm still fascinated with. So what I hear you saying is we're not going to solve that by repurposing that space. Pete Mikulski right there in the cell below you on the call. He's a designer and he works with all these fabulous designers. No amount of redesign is going to fix that floor plate issue. We are not going to all move into what was formerly a Goldman Sachs cubicle. Not going to happen. We can't fix this with design.
Listen, anything's possible. Just the studies that have come out so far suggest that it's a pretty small portion of the total product. And the bigger the bigger reason for underutilization is that the lease prices can't go down to market because of debt service. And the ones that can negotiate probably have very low debt service, have been in the family for years. But that's definitely the challenge. Like, you know,
But once I buy that office tower for pennies on the dollar, I can either knock it down and build housing and hope zoning agrees that we can build housing in the middle of a commercial zone, or I try and redesign what I have.
Well, if you're going to do that, when you think about it, like Midtown office towers, think about it in another way, that there's, you know, typically Class A, B, and C. The upper half of Class A isn't going to see much rent damage. The commercial market has become the best, and all the rest are looking at 20 to 50% cuts on leasing and on a per square foot basis, and very nominal at the very top. So it's a much more bifurcated commercial market in Manhattan than it was before the pandemic, before work from home.
It's not as simple as the Stanford Mall repurposing retail as pickleball courts.
Yes, right. It's not that simple. Right. Well, like if you took one of those office towers and made every floor a pickleball court, I think you'd have oversupply. You'd have too much inventory.
But I love
pickleball.
I love it. But I look to the Japanese model, where in Tokyo, where they have too little space, they got innovative and they started making micro apartments and micro hotels. And I'm wondering whether that's coming to New York.
Well, that was tried 5-7 years ago. And so the idea would be, hey, you know, you build 400 square foot apartments at $2,500 a foot. Like that was kind of the idea. The problem is land costs are still the problem. Like land is still, you know, like when you think about housing costs, and this is, don't take this the wrong way. I'm not being condescending, but land appreciates, improvements, buildings depreciate. So when you see your house selling for more in New Canaan, it's because the land grows in value, not the house itself. And the problem is that land prices are too high to make like affordable housing work, and giving us the that landowners, like like in New York City, there you have the patriarch dying on his deathbed, and the kids are surrounding him, and he's saying to the kids, whatever you do, never sell. Right? I mean, that's kind of
I'm having a tough time, and maybe I'm just not smart enough to figure this out, to reconcile two opposing ideas in my head. But you have just laid out the fact that housing prices is due to rise for the long term, maybe for the next 5 or 10 years. We have too little and it's too expensive to build. And I'm trying to reconcile that with the same timetable where commercial real estate may be in decline, decreasing. And you're saying that we can't marry those two problems together. We can't basically accommodate rising housing prices with decreasing commercial prices.
Well, I think you can on the margin, but not wholesale. Like I think it just doesn't fit. And also, I'm not saying that housing prices are going to go up for the next decade. I'm saying that at least in the near term, that there's no solution for supply that we can see. It doesn't mean there won't be, but the probability seems to suggest that housing prices aren't going to correct in the near term. That's the way I would think of it.
Why won't they, if we have 73 million millennials and they're now approaching 40, the majority of them are approaching 40 and needing larger homes to accommodate
Kids,
more and larger kids?
Listen, I have 3 millennials and 1 Gen Z, and I don't understand any of them. So I don't know.
And they all want houses or apartments?
Three of them own houses, and 1 is living his best life at 24 years old in Manhattan. So
how long will that last? From 24 to what? For the typical?
I would say within 4 or 5 years, he'll be married. He has a long-term girlfriend, they're talking about it, and they're going to buy a house. Like, they already have the money for a down payment. Like, they are super focused on it. So I raised them to buy houses, apparently.
I love that. That might be the best ending yet. I've raised them to buy houses, and every realtor on this call loves hearing those words. I raised them to buy houses.
Well, I believe in
there's
it.
nothing more to be said. Thank you, Jonathan, for another
You
great
bet.
show.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Fantastic.
Anytime.
And you should get the last word, Roberto. How's it out there on Long Island? Is it still paradise? Is it tough to get a reservation on a Friday night?
Oh yeah, impossible.
Are the beaches crowded?
The best reservation is the grill right outside.
Yeah.
And the beach.
You look relaxed. I think that's as big an advertisement for being out on the eastern half of Long Island as anyone could hope for.
I've only been here 3 hours, so it's
All
gonna
right.
get a lot better.
Enjoy your long weekend.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you,
All right,
Jonathan.
great.
Thank you, Roberto.
You bet. Thank you for having me.
See you all next
Cheers,
week.
Scotty.